Hello, everyone, and welcome to Midnight Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin. I was 27 years old when I worked as a groundskeeper at a cemetery in my hometown. It was a small place, the kind of town where everyone more or less knew everyone else, or at least knew of them. There were only about 2,000 people living there, and most families had been around for generations. Names repeated themselves on mailboxes, on storefronts, and eventually on headstones. Working at the cemetery didn't feel strange or creepy to me. If anything, it felt familiar. It was part of the town's rhythm, just another place where life quietly intersected with memory. I worked there for 2 summers. My job involved mowing, trimming, digging graves, maintaining headstones, and helping prepare burial sites for services. Over time, you develop a strange kind of respect for the place. It's quiet, but not empty. Now, you start to recognize names, remember stories you heard growing up, and understand that every stone marks an entire life, not just a date. One day, we were preparing for a cremation burial. A woman had passed away and wanted her ashes placed with her husband's. He had died back in 2014, several years earlier. The plan was to open the existing plot where his ashes were already buried so the family could place hers with his later that day. We dug the hole carefully and opened the box that held his ashes. Everything was done properly and respectfully. Once that part was finished, the sexton and the administrative staff left to handle some paperwork. Before they went, they told me to stay nearby for a bit and keep an eye on things until they returned. It wasn't unusual. Someone always stayed behind to make sure nothing was disturbed before the family arrived. So there I was, alone in the cemetery, with the open plot beside me. The day was quiet. No wind, no birds making much noise, just that soft stillness cemeteries have when nothing's happening. I decided to take a break and lit a cigarette. I sat down on the ground with my back against the headstone, leaning into it the way you might lean against a tree. It felt solid and grounding. I had been sitting there for maybe a minute or two when I heard a voice. It was an old voice, not loud, not sharp, just calm and matter-of-fact. It said, "You shouldn't smoke." Without thinking, I replied, "Yeah, I know." It was automatic. The kind of response you give when someone states something obvious. I didn't even question it at first, but a second later, it hit me. That response didn't make sense. I was alone. There was no one else around. The staff had left, and the family hadn't arrived yet. I looked around. There was nobody there. No footsteps, no movement, no one standing nearby. Just the rows of stones, the open plot, and me. I felt a strange calm instead of fear. My heart didn't race. I didn't feel the urge to run. I just felt present, like something ordinary and extraordinary were happening at the same time. I shifted and sat closer to the open plot, putting my cigarette out. After a short pause, the voice came back. It asked me, "Are you burying Nora?" The way he said her name was gentle, familiar, like he'd said it 1,000 times before. I answered, "Yes, sir." That's when the tone of his voice changed. It went from calm and conversational to openly excited. Oh, there was warmth in it. Joy, relief. He started telling me how happy he was that it was finally happening. He said he'd been waiting for her. He wasn't angry or bitter. He sounded grateful. He said he didn't know how long he'd been waiting, but it felt like 1,000 years. Not in a dramatic way, just as a way of expressing how long the separation had felt to him. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't ask questions. I just listened. For about 5 minutes, he talked. He talked about waiting, about being ready, about how glad he was that they would be together again. There was no sadness in his voice, only anticipation. It was like listening to someone talk about finally being reunited with a loved one after a very long journey. I wasn't scared. If anything, I felt honored, like I'd been allowed to sit in on something deeply personal and private. I didn't feel like I was being spoken to so much as spoken through, as if I was simply the closest living person, and that was enough. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The family arrived. Cars pulled up, doors opened, footsteps approached, voices filled the space, and just like that, the voice was gone. It didn't fade. It didn't trail off. It simply wasn't there anymore. I stood up, wiped my face, and realized I was crying. Not sobbing, just tears slipping out quietly. They weren't tears of fear or confusion. They were tears of joy. I felt genuinely happy for Mr. Edwards. Happy that whatever had just happened, he was no longer waiting. And before the family gathered around the plot, I took a small moment for myself. I had a few trade beads with me, something I carried as personal tokens. I placed them gently beneath the box, right where the ashes would rest. It felt right, like a small gift, a quiet way of acknowledging what I'd experienced and offering something in return. When the family approached, I stepped back and told them everything was ready. They noticed my face. One of them asked if I had known Nora. I paused for just a second and then said, "Only from her husband." They didn't question it. They didn't ask for clarification. They just nodded, maybe assuming I meant stories or reputation, and thanked me. I left them alone to do what families need to do in moments like that. Later that week, I was weed eating around headstones, trimming grass close to the stones so everything looked neat. It was another quiet day. I found myself near the Edwards headstone again. I slowed down, almost without realizing why. For a brief moment, I heard laughter. It wasn't loud. It wasn't startling. It sounded like a man and a woman laughing together, softly, like a shared joke or a moment of happiness. It felt close, like a warm breeze brushing past my ear. And then it was gone. No echo, no lingering sound, just silence. That was the last time anything like that ever happened to me. No more voices, no more sounds, nothing strange or unexplained. Just the usual quiet of the cemetery. I don't try to analyze it too much. I don't feel the need to explain it away or label it. I know what I heard. I know how it felt. And I know that whatever it wasn't frightening. Working in a cemetery teaches you that death doesn't always feel like an ending. Sometimes it feels like a pause. Sometimes it feels like a doorway. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough and open enough, you might witness something that reminds you that love doesn't stop just because life does. That day didn't make me afraid of cemeteries. If anything, it made me respect them even more. They aren't just places where people are buried. They're places where stories finish, where waiting ends, and where every once in a while, someone finally gets to go home. I used to work as a registered nurse in a hospital located in a very well-off town in Mississippi. It was one of those places where the streets were clean, the neighborhoods were quiet, and most people knew each other by name or reputation. The hospital itself reflected that environment. It was well-funded, well-maintained, and generally considered a good place to work. On the surface, nothing about it felt unusual or unsettling. The hospital had 2 intensive care units. The main ICU was always active and full, while the second ICU functioned as an overflow unit. That second unit was located on the third floor and only opened when patient volume required it. It wasn't used all the time, which gave it a different feel. When it was open, it felt quieter, more isolated, and somehow more removed from the rest of the hospital. That overflow ICU had only 7 rooms. Of those 7 rooms, everyone knew there was something wrong with room 2. No one officially talked about it during orientation. There were no warnings written down anywhere. It wasn't something management acknowledged. But among the nurses, techs, and night staff, it was understood. Room 2 was haunted. Not in a joking way, not in a casual, eye-rolling way, in a way that made people lower their voices when they mentioned it. Over the years, numerous nurses had experienced strange things in that room. The most common occurrence was seeing something enter it. More than one nurse on different shifts and different years reported watching what looked like a person walk into room 2. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. They described it as a solid figure, moving with purpose, like a nurse walking into a patient's room. The unsettling part was that when they followed to check, the room was empty. No patient, no staff member, no explanation. This happened enough times that it stopped being brushed off as imagination. These were experienced nurses, people who worked long hours under stress and knew the difference between fatigue and reality. They weren't hysterical or dramatic. They would simply come back to the desk, shaken, and say something like, "I just saw someone go into room 2, but there's no one there." Most of the time, room 2 didn't even have a patient in it. The air around that room always felt different. Even during the day when the unit was busy, room 2 felt colder somehow. Not in temperature, but in presence. Nurses would step inside and feel watched. It was subtle, but persistent. You never stayed in there longer than necessary. The most disturbing incident happened when room 2 actually had a patient assigned to it. It was a night shift, the kind where the hospital feels like a completely different world. The lights are dimmer, the hallways quieter, and time seems to slow down. It was around 4 in the morning, that strange hour when exhaustion and alertness exist at the same time. A nurse was assigned to a patient in room 2. The patient was stable, but required routine care. At some point during the shift, the nurse prepared to go in and change the patient's dressing. She gathered her supplies, walked into the room, and explained to the patient what she was about to do. The patient looked at her confused. "What are you talking about?" the patient asked. The nurse said, I'm here to change your dressing." The patient immediately responded, "Oh no, you don't need to do that. That other nurse was just in here about 30 minutes ago, and they already did it." The nurse paused. She knew that wasn't possible. There were only 2 nurses on the unit that night, she and one other nurse. She hadn't been in the room earlier, and she knew for a fact the other nurse hadn't either. Still, she didn't want to alarm the patient, so she calmly said, "Okay," and checked the dressing anyway. It was fresh, clean, properly applied. Exactly how it should have been if it had just been changed. The nurse felt a chill move through her. She didn't say anything to the patient. She finished checking everything, made sure the patient was comfortable, and then left the room. She went straight to the nurse's station, where the only other nurse on duty was sitting. Trying to keep her voice steady, she said, "Hey, thanks for changing the dressing in a room 2 earlier." The other nurse looked up at her, completely confused. "I didn't change any dressing," she said. The first nurse laughed nervously, assuming maybe the other nurse just didn't remember. "Yes, you did," she said. "The patient said you were just in there." The second nurse's face went pale. "No," she said slowly. "I haven't been in that room all night." They both stood there in silence, staring at each other as the realization sank in. There was no third nurse, no student, no tech, no one else assigned to that unit. They both went back to the room together. The patient was calm, resting, unaware that anything was wrong. When asked again, the patient described a nurse coming in, speaking softly and changing the dressing. The description matched what any competent nurse would do, but the patient couldn't give details about who it was, just that it was a nurse doing their job. After that night, neither nurse ever wanted to be assigned to room 2 again. Stories like that circulated quietly among staff. They weren't exaggerated. They weren't retold for entertainment. They were shared carefully, often in hushed tones, usually late at night when fewer people were around. The consistency of the stories was what made them unsettling. Different nurses, different years, same experiences. Eventually, a rumor surfaced that seemed to tie everything together. Years earlier, a registered nurse who had worked at that hospital for a very long time had died in room 2. She had been a dedicated nurse, well respected, and someone who lived for her job and cared deeply about her patients. According to the rumor, she passed away suddenly while working or shortly after becoming a patient herself. No one could confirm the details officially. Hospitals don't talk openly about things like that. But the story persisted, passed down from nurse to nurse like an unofficial piece of unit history. If it was true, it somehow made the experiences feel less frightening and more sad. If there really was something lingering in that room, it didn't seem malicious. It didn't try to scare anyone. It didn't hurt patients. If anything, it seemed to keep doing what it had always done. Walking into rooms, checking on patients, changing dressings, providing care. That idea unsettled people more than the thought of a hostile ghost ever could. Eventually, the hospital closed. Healthcare systems changed, services were consolidated, and the building was no longer needed as a medical facility. For a while, it sat unused, quiet, and empty, holding decades of memories within its walls. Later, the building was repurposed. It became a dormitory for a large college. Students moved in. Young people filled the halls with laughter, music, and late-night conversations. Rooms that once held critically ill patients now held bunk beds, desks, and posters. The ICU floors were converted into living spaces. Room numbers changed. Walls were repainted. New life replaced old routines. Most of those students had no idea what the building used to be. They didn't know that lives had been saved and lost there. They didn't know about the overflow ICU on the 3rd floor, or the small unit with 7 rooms. They definitely didn't know about room 2. But some buildings remember. Hospitals, especially, absorb an incredible amount of human emotion. Fear, hope, grief, determination, relief, exhaustion. All of it exists intensely and constantly within those walls. It's not surprising that some places feel different long after their original purpose is gone. Sometimes people say that energy doesn't disappear, it just changes form. If that's true, then maybe somewhere on that 3rd floor, in whatever room now stands, where room 2 once was, a nurse still walks in during the quiet hours, still checks on patients who aren't there anymore, still changes dressings that don't need changing. And now, instead of night shift nurses trading uneasy glances at the desk, it might be college students laughing off strange footsteps, doors opening for no reason, or the feeling that someone just walked into their room when no one is there. Fun times indeed. Or maybe not. I used to work at an old skilled nursing facility, the kind of place that never really lets go of its past. The building was first constructed in 1888, and even before I ever set foot inside it, It had already lived many lives. You could feel that the moment you walked through the doors. The air itself felt heavy, like it had absorbed more than a century of memories, grief, routines, and quiet endings. Originally, the facility was created for women who had nowhere else to go. In those days, women were not allowed to own property or manage estates on their own. If a woman lost her husband or her family, she often lost her home as well. Many of them were forced to sign over whatever assets they had left just to secure a place to live out their remaining years. This building became their final refuge. They arrived with little more than their clothes, their faith, and the understanding that this would be the last place they ever lived. By the time I started working there, the building was already more than 100 years old. The structure still stood proudly, though time had left its marks everywhere. The walls were thick, the hallways long and narrow, and the floors creaked no matter how softly you walked. There was a particular smell to the place that never quite went away, a mix of old wood, cleaning supplies, and something else that was harder to describe. It wasn't unpleasant, just deeply familiar, like stepping into a memory that didn't belong to you. Eventually, the owners built a newer facility just down the street, modern and bright, with wider hallways and updated rooms. The residents were moved there, and the original building became administrative offices for executives and management. But when I worked there, the old building was still very much alive with residents, staff, and routines that had been repeated for generations. I was a CNA, and death was a regular part of life there. The women who lived at the facility were elderly, many of them very frail, and it wasn't unusual for someone to pass away. We were trained for that reality. We knew how to care for the dying, how to keep them comfortable, and how to maintain professionalism when the inevitable happened. What we were not trained for were the patterns that started to emerge. There was one wing in particular where strange things seemed to happen more often. A week or so before a resident would die, she would start to complain about children playing. It was always the same description. 2 children, a boy and a girl. They were always dressed in what the women called church clothes. The boy would be neat and quiet, the girl polite and well-behaved. The residents described them as calm, never loud or disruptive, just present. What made it unsettling was that no one else ever saw these children. There were no children living in the facility, and visiting hours were strictly controlled. Yet the stories were always the same, even when the women had never met each other or shared rooms. They would mention the children casually at first, as if it were nothing unusual. Some would smile when they talked about them. Others seemed confused, asking why children were allowed to run through the halls. At first, the staff brushed it off as confusion or dementia. That was the easiest explanation. And in healthcare, you learn quickly to cling to logic where you can. But the consistency was impossible to ignore. Same 2 children, same clothing, same timing, always about a week before death. Then came the second part. As the residents grew weaker, they would begin saying something else. Almost always, they would tell us they had seen the doctor. That alone wasn't strange, except for the fact that no doctor had visited them. Some would say it differently. They would say a man with a satchel had come to see them. Others described him as kind, quiet, and reassuring. He never rushed. He never frightened them. He simply spoke to them calmly, as if explaining something important. Every single one of them said this. After mentioning the doctor or the man with the satchel, they would change. Their fear disappeared. Their anxiety faded. They would look at the staff with peaceful expressions and say the same thing, almost word for word. "I'm ready to go now." Within 2 days, they would be gone. It didn't matter if they had been holding on for weeks or if their decline had been sudden. Once those words were spoken, the timeline was always the same. 48 hours, sometimes less. Death followed quietly, without struggle, as if they had simply accepted an invitation. That was unsettling enough, but the staff also began to notice something else. When a resident passed away, something would happen in the building before any official announcement was made. We would see a woman walking through the halls. She wore clothing from the early part of the century, long before our time. Her dress was modest and practical. Her boots were laced tightly all the way up. Over her arm, and she carried neatly folded white towels. She never spoke. She never looked at us. She walked with purpose, always toward the room of the woman who had just died. At first, people assumed they were imagining things. Long shifts, emotional strain, exhaustion. But then multiple staff members started seeing her independently of one another. Different shifts, different days, same description, same behavior. She would appear shortly after a death, before families were notified, before paperwork was completed. She moved through the hallways as if she belonged there, as if she had walked those floors for decades. And maybe she had. Once she entered the room, she was never seen again. That was how we knew someone had passed away, even before checking vitals or charts. If you saw the woman with the towels, you knew. Strangely, none of us felt afraid. There was no sense of danger, no cold dread. Instead, there was a strange comfort in her presence. She didn't feel like something unwanted or malicious. She felt like part of the building itself, like a caretaker who had never stopped doing her job. Over time, the fear faded and was replaced by something closer to respect. The building took care of its own. It always had. The longer I worked there, the more attached I became to the place. It was old, imperfect, and sometimes unsettling, but it had a soul. You could feel it in the quiet hours of the night shift, when the halls were dim and the world outside felt far away. You could feel it in the way sound carried differently, as if the walls remembered voices long gone. When the residents were moved to the new building, something changed. The new place was efficient, clean, and well lit, but it felt empty. It did its job, but it had no stories in its bones, no echoes, no watchers. The original building still stands today, now filled with offices and paperwork and meetings. People walk its halls without knowing what once happened there, without knowing who once walked beside them unseen. Sometimes I wonder if the children are still there, waiting quietly. If the man with the satchel still comes when it's time. If the woman with the towels still makes her rounds, unseen by those who no longer believe. I miss that building. I miss the quiet understanding that death wasn't something to fear there, only something to prepare for. I miss the feeling that no one died alone. And most of all, I miss the ghosts. I used to work at a very old country club, the kind of place that felt like it belonged to a different era entirely. I'm not exactly sure of the exact year it was built, but from everything I was told and from the way the building looked, it dated back to the late 1800s, even before anyone mentioned its history. You could feel its age. The walls were thick, the ceilings high, and the layout felt old-fashioned, like it had been designed for a slower, quieter world. The club had been through a lot over the years. One of the stories that was told almost like a legend among staff was about a massive natural disaster that hit the town long before any of us worked there. It was bad enough that the local infrastructure couldn't handle the number dead. The town needed somewhere to store bodies temporarily while they worked through the damage and began cleaning everything up. The country club, with its large open ballroom, became a makeshift morgue. That ballroom was still there when I worked there. It had been renovated, of course, cleaned up and repurposed for weddings, banquets, and special events. On the surface, it looked elegant and inviting. But once you knew what had happened there, it was impossible not to think about it. Hundreds of people had been laid out in that space, lifeless and waiting, while the town recovered from chaos. Even though decades had passed, the story clung to the room like a shadow. I worked as a bartender, which meant my hours often ran late. Most nights, I was responsible for closing the place down. By the time the last guest left, the rest of the staff would be long gone. I'd wipe down the bar, lock up the liquor, count the till, and slowly make my way through the building, switching off lights and making sure everything was secure. That was when the place really started to feel different. During the day, the country club felt warm and lively. Members laughed, glasses clinked, music played softly in the background. But at night, when the building emptied out, it transformed. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the walls themselves were listening. Every footstep echoed just a little too loudly. Every small sound felt amplified. Nothing ever happened that was outright ghostly in the way you see in movies. No apparitions floating down hallways, no voices whispering your name. But there were enough small things, repeated often enough, that they got under your skin. One of the most common things was the lights. More times than I can count. I would finish my closing routine, walk out to the parking lot, get into my car, and glance back at the building. That's when I'd see it. Lights on in the bar area. Lights I knew for a fact I had turned off. At first I thought I was just tired. Long shifts will mess with your head. I'd sit there for a moment, staring, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. But the glow through the windows was unmistakable. The bar lights were on. The worst part wasn't the inconvenience. It was the walk back inside. I'd get out of my car, lock it, and head back toward the entrance. The building would be completely dark except for that one lit area, which somehow made it feel even more unsettling. I'd unlock the door and step inside, and the silence would hit me all over again. Walking through that building alone at night was never easy. The halls felt longer. The corners felt darker. I always had the sense that I wasn't actually alone, even though I knew logically that I was. I'd reach the bar, flip off the lights, and stand there for a moment, waiting, listening. Nothing would happen. No sounds, no movement, just quiet. Then I'd leave again, hoping this time it would stick. Sometimes it didn't. Another thing that happened far too often, to be coincidence, was the stereo system. I'd shut it off before leaving, making sure it was completely powered down. And yet, more than once, I'd be halfway across the parking lot when faint music would start playing inside. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to notice. There was nothing quite like standing alone in a dark parking lot. Hearing music start up in a building you were certain you had just shut down. That usually meant another trip back inside. The stereo would be on, playing like nothing was unusual. I'd turn it off again, double-check everything, and leave with my heart pounding just a little faster than it should have. Then there were the smaller things. The things that were easy to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore altogether. Silverware would go missing constantly. Not in a way that made sense. You'd set down a stack of forks, turn around to grab something else, and when you looked back, they were gone. Dishes would disappear and reappear in places no one remembered putting them. You'd swear you left something in a specific spot because you always did it the same way, only to find it somewhere else later. At first, everyone blamed everyone else. Maybe another staff member moved it. Maybe a cleaner picked it up. Maybe someone was just forgetful. But even when you were alone, even when no one else was around, things still went missing. The feeling was never aggressive or threatening. It was more like being gently messed with, like whatever was there wanted to be noticed but didn't want to scare anyone too badly. Despite all of this, it really was a great place to work. The members were mostly kind. The tips were good. The building was beautiful in its own way, especially during events when it was full of life and laughter. But there was an unspoken understanding among the staff. Everyone knew the place was haunted. No one made a big deal out of it. It was just something you accepted. Like a quirk of the job. New hires would usually figure it out on their own after a few late nights. Eventually, someone would mention it casually, and the new person would realize they weren't imagining things. It wasn't a place that wanted to hurt anyone. If anything, it felt like the building just refused to be empty. After everything it had seen, after serving as a place for celebration and tragedy alike, maybe it didn't know how to be quiet anymore. Even now, when I think back on that job, I remember the nerves, the strange moments, and the way my skin would prickle when I had to walk through those dark halls alone. But I also remember feeling strangely connected to the place, like I was part of a long line of people who had passed through it, all leaving something behind. Looking back, the haunting didn't make the place worse. If anything, it made it unforgettable. Sorry to interrupt for just a moment. If you're new here, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers for daily true horror stories that stay with you long after they're told, quietly unsettling and meant for the late hours. You can also turn on notifications so you're always here when a new story arrives and the night begins to stir again. Now, let's continue. I used to live at the cemetery where I worked, and even now, that sentence alone feels strange to say out loud. At the time, though, it felt practical. The job came with housing, and the house itself was attached to the cemetery office. It made sense on paper. It saved money, cut down on commute time, and gave me a quiet place to live. What I didn't fully understand back then was how different quiet feels when it comes from a place where thousands of people are buried. The cemetery was old. Not ancient, but old enough that many of the headstones were worn smooth by time and weather. Some names were barely readable anymore. Trees lined the paths, tall and mature, their branches stretching over the graves like arms that had been frozen in mid-gesture. During the day, the place was peaceful in a way that felt almost comforting. Birds nested in the trees, and the sound of wind moving through the leaves softened everything. At night, it was different. The house itself was part of a small structure that included the office. From the outside, it looked like one connected building, but inside it was clearly divided into spaces meant for work and spaces meant for living. The layout was a little unusual, probably altered over time to fit changing needs. You could tell it wasn't originally designed to be someone's home. From the kitchen, there was a doorway that led directly into an office area. That office wasn't large, but it felt enclosed, like it had absorbed years of paperwork, meetings, and quiet conversations. From that office, another doorway led into a sitting room. That sitting room felt separate from the rest of the house in a way that was hard to explain. It wasn't darker or colder exactly, just disconnected, like it existed slightly out of step with everything else. I lived there with my dog, and he was normally calm, confident, and curious. He wasn't the type to spook easily. Loud noises didn't bother him much, and new places usually excited him. He was protective, sure, but not reactive without reason. That's why what happened that day stuck with me so deeply. It was a normal day. Nothing unusual had happened at work. The weather was mild, and the cemetery had been quiet. By the time I got home, I felt relaxed enough to cook dinner. I was standing in the kitchen, moving between the counter and the stove, thinking about nothing in particular, That's when my dog suddenly stood up. He had been lying down nearby, relaxed, half asleep. 1 second, he was calm. The next, he was rigid. His ears went up, his body stiffened, and then he started barking. Not playful barking, not alert barking. This was deep, urgent, serious barking. He was staring directly at the doorway that led from the kitchen into the office. At first, I assumed he'd heard something outside. Maybe a car, maybe an animal. But the way he was focused didn't feel like that. His eyes were locked on the doorway itself, not beyond it. Not toward a window, toward the empty frame of the office door. I said his name, half laughing, half annoyed, telling him to knock it off, but he didn't even look at me. As he barked, something about his behavior changed. Instead of staying in one place, he started to move, slowly, carefully. Step by step, he edged closer to the office doorway, never breaking eye contact with whatever he thought was there. His body language shifted from aggressive to fearful. His tail lowered. His movements became hesitant. It was like he felt pulled forward and terrified at the same time. That was when I started to feel uneasy. I followed him into the office, asking him what he was doing, trying to keep my tone light, but my heart rate had picked up. There was something wrong with the way he was acting. He reached the doorway between the office and the sitting room and stopped dead. He stood right at the threshold and barked full force into the sitting room. He would not step inside. I watched him for a moment, trying to make sense of it. His entire body was tense. The hair along his back was raised, standing up in a clear line. His barking wasn't random. It was directed, focused, as if he could see something just beyond that doorway. I leaned forward and looked into the sitting room. There was nothing there. The room looked exactly as it always did. Furniture in its usual places, curtains still, no movement, no shadows doing anything strange, no sounds, just an empty room. I stepped fully into the sitting room, turning slowly, checking corners, checking behind furniture, feeling a little ridiculous, but also very alert. Still nothing. I called my dog, telling him it was fine, telling him to come in. He wouldn't. He continued barking, his paws planted firmly on the office floor. He wouldn't cross the threshold. No amount of coaxing made a difference. I tried using a calmer voice. I tried sounding authoritative. I even tried grabbing a treat. Nothing worked. He stayed right where he was, barking into the room like it was occupied by something only he could see. His growls had a low, vibrating quality to them, like he was warning something to stay back. That's when the realization hit me. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't confusion. This was fear. And it wasn't fear of a noise or smell. It was fear of a specific place. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't see anything, but suddenly I felt very aware of the space around me. The sitting room felt heavier than it had moments before. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on me. I became acutely aware of my own breathing. The sound of it suddenly, too loud in my ears. I backed out of the sitting room slowly, never taking my eyes off it. I didn't want to turn my back on it, even though I had no logical reason to feel that way. Once I was back in the office, I closed the door to the sitting room. My dog didn't stop barking immediately. He stood there, staring at the closed door, growling under his breath. His body was still tense, still alert. I closed the door between the office and the kitchen as well, putting another barrier between us and that room. Eventually, the barking slowed. He sat down, but he never relaxed. His eyes kept drifting back toward the door. Every now and then, a low growl would escape him, quiet but unmistakable. I tried to go back to cooking, but my appetite was gone. The normal sounds of the house felt wrong. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a clock, everything felt amplified. For the rest of the evening, my dog refused to go anywhere near that side of the house. He stuck close to me, following me from room to room. Anytime a sound came from that direction, his ears went up and his body tensed again. That night, I didn't sleep well. Living at the cemetery already came with a certain awareness of death. You'd see funerals during the day, hear stories from families, walk past graves that dated back generations. I had accepted all of that as part of the job. It felt respectful, solemn, but not frightening. What happened in the house felt different. It felt personal. Animals don't imagine things the way people do. They don't know local legends. They don't tell themselves stories to fill silence. When they react like that, it's because something in their instincts tells them they should. I never saw anything in that sitting room. Not before that day, and not after. But from that moment on, it never felt the same. Even in daylight, it carried a strange tension, like a held breath. My dog never entered that room again unless absolutely forced to, and even then, he rushed through it, clearly uncomfortable. Most of the time, he avoided it completely. I eventually learned to do the same. Living there taught me something important. Not everything strange comes with dramatic signs. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's just a feeling. Sometimes it's watching an animal you trust react in a way that doesn't make sense unless something unseen is present. I don't know what was in that room, or if it was connected to the cemetery at all. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But I do know that whatever my dog sensed that day was real enough to him to trigger pure fears. And that was enough for me. Even now, years later, I still think about that moment. About the barking. About the refusal to cross that doorway. About the way the house felt after. Some places remember things. And sometimes the living aren't the first to notice. When I was growing up, we had a dog who was part of the family in every sense of the word. He wasn't skittish, and he wasn't the type to panic easily. He had his quirks, sure, like any dog does, but for the most part, he was calm, loyal, and predictable. That's probably why the things he did in that house stuck with me for so long. There was a corner of my room where the computer desk sat. It was nothing special. Just a normal setup against the wall, the kind almost every household had at the time. The room itself wasn't creepy. It didn't feel cold or dark or strange. It was just my bedroom, a place where I slept, played games, and wasted time like any kid would. Every once in a while, though, my dog would bark at that corner. At first, it didn't bother me much. Dogs bark at shadows, reflections, noises humans can't hear. And anyone who's lived with a dog long enough knows that sometimes they do things that make absolutely no sense. So when he'd suddenly stand up, stare at that corner, and start barking, I'd usually roll my eyes and tell him to knock it off. Still, there was something about it that felt off. It wasn't playful barking or alert barking like he'd do when someone was at the door. It was focused, direct, like he was barking at something specific rather than reacting to a random sound. His eyes would lock onto that spot, where the wall met the floor, right beside the desk. Sometimes his body would stiffen, and sometimes the hair on the back of his neck would rise slightly. Most of the time, I brushed it off. Then one day it happened while I was sitting right there. I was at the computer, doing whatever it was I did back then, probably playing a game or browsing online. I wasn't paying much attention to anything else. The room was quiet, normal, comfortable. My dog was nearby, lying down, relaxed. Without warning, he jumped to his feet and started barking. Not just barking, but barking hard, loud, aggressive. His attention was locked on the corner of the room, the exact same spot he'd fixated on before. Except this time, I was only a few feet away from where he was barking. That made it different. Suddenly, I wasn't just hearing it. I was right next to it. Right next to the space he was reacting to. The sound of his barking felt sharper, more intense, bouncing off the walls of the room. My stomach tightened, and a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with temperature. I told him to stop. He didn't. I tried again, louder this time, but he completely ignored me. His eyes never left that corner. His body was tense, rigid, like he was bracing himself for something. That's when I decided to get him out of the room. I stood up and grabbed his collar, expecting some resistance, but nothing major. Dogs don't usually want to leave when they're worked up, but I figured I'd be able to pull him along without much trouble. I was wrong. The moment I started dragging him toward the door, it felt like trying to pull a massive stone across the floor. He planted his paws and leaned back with unbelievable strength. I couldn't understand how he was resisting me so hard. He wasn't growling at me. He wasn't snapping. He just refused to move, as if something invisible was anchoring him in place. His barking didn't stop. It echoed in my ears, frantic and desperate. And the closer I got to the door, the harder he fought me. I remember feeling shocked by how strong he suddenly was. It didn't feel like normal resistance. It felt panicked, like he didn't want to turn his back on that corner even for a second. Finally, inch by inch, I managed to drag him to the threshold of the room. The moment his front paws crossed into the hallway, everything changed. He broke free from my grip and bolted. He didn't just run. He launched himself down the hallway at full speed, nails scrambling against the floor, his body low and fast. There was an urgency in his movement that I had never seen before. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. He ran straight into my parents' bedroom. The door was open, and he flew inside, disappearing behind the bed. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. The barking had stopped, replaced by silence so sudden it felt unnatural. I slowly walked down the hallway and stood in the doorway of my parents' room. My dog was crouched behind the bed, pressed against the wall, trembling. His eyes were wide. His breathing was fast and shallow. He looked terrified. I had never seen him like that. This wasn't excitement. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't him reacting to a noise or a smell. This was raw fear. I crouched down and called his name softly. He didn't come out. He just stayed there, shaking, watching the doorway like he expected something to follow him. It took a long time before he finally calmed down enough to move, and even then, he stayed close to my parents, refusing to leave the room. I went back to my bedroom alone. Standing there by myself felt wrong. The corner looked the same as it always had. Same wall, same desk, same computer. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had moved. There was no sound, no shadow, no explanation waiting for me. But the room felt different. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I became painfully aware of how quiet everything was. Every small sound made me tense. The hum of electronics, the distant noise from another part of the house, even my own breathing felt too loud. I didn't sit back down at the computer. Instead, I turned off the monitor, grabbed what I needed, and left the room, shutting the door behind me. That corner stayed in my mind the rest of the night, even though I try not to think about it. I never jumped to the conclusion that it was a ghost or anything supernatural. I still don't. There could have been a noise I couldn't hear, a vibration. Something in the wall, something my dog picked up on that I never would. Logic tells me there had to be some explanation. But logic doesn't erase the feeling. What stuck with me wasn't just the barking, it was the resistance. The way he fought me like his life depended on it. the way he ran the moment he had the chance, the look in his eyes when he finally stopped moving. That fear was real. Over time, the barking at the corner happened less often, or maybe I just paid less attention to it. I didn't sit at the computer late at night anymore. I avoided that spot when I could. My dog never liked being in that room for long after that, and he always positioned himself so he could see the doorway. Years later, I still think about that moment. Dogs don't overthink. They don't imagine things the way humans do. They react to what they sense, what their instincts tell them. And that day, every instinct in my dog told him that something was wrong enough to flee in absolute terror. I don't know what scared him. I just know it scared me too, and sometimes that's enough. My childhood home was haunted by the ghosts of my maternal grandparents. That's not something I say lightly, and it's not something I grew up questioning or being afraid of. It was simply a fact of life in that house. My grandfather was the one who appeared the most, though we would occasionally see my grandmother as well. Their presence felt familiar, almost domestic, as if they were still part of the household, rather than something separate from it. My sister and I were very young when we first saw them. I was 7, and she was 8. At that time, we shared a bedroom. It was a normal kid's room, cluttered with toys, mismatched furniture, and the kind of mess children swear they know the exact location of. Nothing about the room felt unusual or eerie before that night. We were both asleep when the bedroom door opened. It wasn't slammed open or forced. It just slowly swung inward, the way a door does when someone familiar enters, without trying to be quiet. The sound of it was enough to wake us both up. I remember opening my eyes and immediately knowing that something had changed, even before fully registering what I was seeing. Standing in the doorway were 2 people. They didn't move toward us. They didn't speak. They just stood there, side by side, calmly occupying the space as if they belonged there. It took a few seconds for my sleepy brain to process what was happening. I remember blinking, rubbing my eyes, and then looking again. They were an older man and an older woman. The man stood slightly forward, like he was the more confident of the 2. The woman was just behind him, her posture gentle and quiet. They weren't glowing or transparent or anything dramatic like that. They looked solid, real, like actual people standing in our doorway. We weren't scared. That's the part that surprises people the most when I tell this story. There was no panic, no screaming, no sense of dread. If anything, we were annoyed. We had been woken up, and at that age, sleep interruption felt like a personal offense. I remember sitting up in bed and squinting at them, irritated. My sister did the same. Neither of us recognized them as people we knew, but we also didn't question how they were there. Our immediate assumption was that they were friends of our parents. We didn't say anything to them. They didn't say anything to us. After a few moments, the door closed again, just as calmly as it had opened. We went back to sleep. The next morning, we were irritated enough to bring it up. At breakfast, we complained to our parents about being woken up in the middle of the night. We told them they shouldn't let their friends come upstairs and disturb us while we were sleeping. My parents were confused. They told us no one had been over the night before. No friends, no visitors, no one who would have been upstairs at all. We insisted they were wrong. We described the man and the woman in detail. Their height, their clothing, the way they stood in the doorway. As we talked, my mother went very quiet. Then she started to cry. That was the first moment I realized something was truly wrong, or at least unusual. My sister and I stopped talking. unsure of what we had done. My mom sat down and covered her face, trying to pull herself together. When she finally spoke, she told us something we didn't know. My grandmother had died before my parents ever got married. My grandfather had died when I was less than a year old. There were no photographs of them displayed around the house, not framed, not tucked into albums we had access to. The only things we had from them were paintings they had created, hanging quietly on the walls like any other artwork. And yet my sister and I had described them perfectly. The man we saw was my grandfather. The woman was my grandmother. My mom wasn't afraid. If anything, she seemed relieved. She said she had always known her father was still around. She had felt it for years, especially in that house. Hearing our story didn't frighten her. It confirmed something she already believed. There was a reason she believed it. After my grandfather passed away, my parents ran into a serious problem. They couldn't find the deed to the house, not just misplaced, but completely missing. They searched everywhere. They went through drawers, boxes, cabinets, books, files. They removed items from rooms one by one, checking every possible hiding place. Nothing. Eventually, they went through my grandfather's old room. They took everything out. Clothes, furniture, personal items. Everything was removed and searched thoroughly. By the end of it, the room was nearly empty. The only things left were an old television and the stand it sat on. At some point during this process, my mother was in the kitchen, trying to keep herself busy while also worrying about what they would do if they couldn't locate the paperwork. Suddenly, she heard the television turn on in my grandfather's room. She went in and turned it off. Old electronics do that sometimes. She didn't think much of it. She went back to the kitchen. A few minutes later, the television turned on again. She went back and shut it off once more, this time feeling a little unsettled, but still trying to stay logical. Maybe a wiring issue, maybe a faulty switch. She returned to the kitchen. Then it happened again. The television turned on a third time. This time, my mom felt something shift. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. She knew deep down that this wasn't random. She walked back into the room, expecting the television to be on again. It wasn't. Instead, sitting right in the middle of the empty floor was an envelope. It hadn't been there before. She knew that for a fact. The room had been cleared out completely. There was nowhere it could have fallen from, and nowhere it could have been overlooked. Inside the envelope were the deed to the house, other important paperwork, and some bonds my grandfather had owned. Everything they had been searching for. After that, my mom never doubted that her father was still around. He wasn't trapped or angry or confused. He was just present, watching, making sure things were taken care of. That understanding carried over into our childhood. We would see him occasionally. Always calm, always quiet. Sometimes he would stand in doorways. Sometimes he would appear briefly in a room and then be gone the next moment. My grandmother appeared less often, but when she did, it felt gentle, almost shy, like she didn't want to intrude too much. They never frightened us. If anything, they felt like grandparents who didn't quite know how to interact with grandchildren they never really got to meet in life. There was a sense of familiarity without direct interaction, like they were checking in, making sure everything was okay. The house never felt threatening. There were no cold spots, no slamming doors, no angry energy. It felt watched over, protected in a quiet way. Looking back now, I understand how strange it all sounds. I understand why people are skeptical. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I might be too. But the consistency of it, the shared experiences, and the way my mother reacted all make it impossible for me to dismiss. We didn't grow up afraid of ghosts. We grew up with family who simply hadn't left yet. Even now, thinking back on that house, I don't remember fear. I remember being annoyed at being woken up. I remember my mom crying, not out of terror, but out of recognition and relief. I remember the sense that some bonds don't end just because someone dies. Some people move on. Some people stay close. And sometimes they still check on the kids sleeping down the hall. If you're still here, then these stories didn't simply fade away. They settled in. Every story you heard tonight came from real moments, real people, and real situations where something felt off or nearly went wrong. If you want to keep exploring stories that linger in your thoughts long after the night grows quiet, consider subscribing to Midnight Whispers. There are more stories waiting in the dark, and not all of them let you leave in time.